For 4 long years, Paris had listened to a single rhythm: German boots, German trucks, and German orders echoing through streets that once belonged to the world's most vibrant city. But on a warm August morning in 1944, something changed. It began as a distant rumble. Quiet at first, uncertain. A vibration in the cobblestones that made a few shopkeepers raise their heads. That made one elderly woman stop halfway down a staircase. That made a young boy on the aisle de la Cite whisper, "Maman, listen," and for the first time since 1940. The sound didn't feel like occupation, it felt like hope. Parisians poured onto balconies, leaned out of windows, abandoned their errands in mid-step. Someone shouted, "Is it them? Are they here?" Another voice yelled to strangers gathered below, "No, it cannot be, it's too soon." And then, with a clarity that broke through 4 years of suffocating silence, they came into view. British troops marching straight into Paris. No one in the city knew what to expect next. But the words French civilians spoke that day would echo for decades. To understand what the civilians felt, you must first understand what Paris had become. In 1944, the Paris the world romanticizes was gone, buried beneath restrictions, fear, and the iron weight of Nazi rule. For 4 years, Parisians woke not to the smell of café bread, but to ration lines twisting endlessly down quiet streets. Butter was a memory. Meat was a luxury. Coffee? Only as a dream. The German flag hung over the Hotel de Ville like a storm cloud that refused to move. Every shopkeeper learned to speak in whispers. Every child learned to look away when German patrols passed. And every adult learned never to trust the rumors, because rumors had been the city's cruelest tormentor. Resistance members disappeared in the night. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. German trucks rolled through the city with a confidence that told Parisians, "We are not leaving." The city of lights had become the city of shadows. So when August 1944 arrived and the tides of war shifted, Parisians struggled to believe it. They had forgotten the feeling of liberation. The idea that foreign troops might march through their streets not as conquerors, but as saviors. That is why, on the day the British arrived, the shock was overwhelming. Because for 4 years nothing in Paris had changed, and then, in a single hour, everything did. The first whisper came days before British boots touched Paris soil. A woman at the market said she heard from a cousin's husband that the Allies were already in the suburbs. A young resistance courier stopped in a bakery long enough to mutter, "They're closer than you think." A priest told his congregation, "Pray, the hour approaches." But after years of crushed hope, Parisians had learned a painful reflex: do not believe good news. Every street had someone saying, "No, no. The Germans are still too strong." Another added, "We will not be free until next year." Others insisted that even if the Allies reached Paris, the Germans would destroy the city rather than give it up. Nobody dared to imagine British troops in the capital. So when the first bells rang from the south side of Paris, people froze. And when a woman leaned over the balcony of her apartment near the Boulevard Saint-Germain and screamed with a voice cracked by disbelief, "Les voilà! They're here!" Paris erupted. They did not arrive like conquerors. They arrived like men who had fought across continents. The first British column advanced slowly, worn, dusty, the sun glinting off their vehicles. Behind them marched infantry, steady, calm, almost solemn. One French civilian said later, "They looked like giants, yet they walked as if they carried the weight of every mile from Normandy on their shoulders." Within seconds, the streets were overflowing. People surged forward faster than police or resistance fighters could control. Children climbed lampposts to get a better view. Women pressed forward with bouquets of flowers. Old men waved canes in the air, shouting prayers of gratitude. French flags hidden for years were pulled from closets and waved wildly. Some were tattered, some were handmade overnight. But each one felt like a declaration of rebirth. The British troops tried to keep formation, but it became impossible. A young woman ran straight toward the marching line and threw her arms around the first soldier she could reach. He froze, awkward, surprised, humbled. She whispered through tears, "Vous êtes Venus, you came." Within minutes, the city transformed. Flags draped from the windows of buildings long darkened by fear. Flower petals showered the troops from balconies. A choir of car horns, cheering, clapping, and joyous screaming filled every street. One Parisian later said, "It felt as if every wall, every stone, every corner of the city was exhaling at the same time." people ran alongside the vehicles. Little boys tried to touch the tanks. Teenagers climbed onto armored cars just to wave at the crowd. A British sergeant would later confess, "When we entered Paris, it felt like driving into the beating heart of freedom. For the civilians, it was the first time in years that life tasted real." The voices of Parisians rose like a storm around the British column. Some shouted, "Vive les Anglais! Vive Churchill! Merci, merci!" Others spoke with tears streaming down their cheeks. "We waited for you for 4 years." A grandmother in a black shawl approached a young British private and pressed her hands against his face. She looked at him as if looking at her own son returned from the dead. Through trembling lips, she whispered, "You saved Paris." Another man who had lost 2 brothers to forced labor camps lifted a British soldier onto his feet and shouted to the crowd, "These are our liberators, our friends!" Wherever the soldiers walked, hands reached out to touch them, hands desperate to feel hope made real. Paris had seen armies before, but not like this. Civilians later described the British soldiers the same way again and again: calm, disciplined, humane. Exhausted, yet unbreakable. One woman wrote in her diary, "They did not strut. They did not boast. They walked as if they knew the world wanted to thank them. And yet they thanked us instead." Another civilian recalled, "They smiled, but the smiles were small. They had seen too much. But even so, they made us feel safe simply by marching past us." The contrast was staggering. German troops had marched through Paris in 1940 with arrogance and triumph. The British marched in 1944 with dignity and humility. That difference is what Parisians remembered. The peak came near the Champs-Élysées. As a line of British infantry reached the wide avenue, thousands of civilians surged forward from side streets and squares. Suddenly, the cheering swelled into something beyond human, something primal, something centuries old. It was not just a crowd celebrating soldiers. It was a city reclaiming its soul. A British corporal wrote home, "The noise? I have never heard anything like it." Paris seemed to lift itself into the air. Women kissed the soldiers' cheeks. Children handed them handwritten notes. Old men saluted and shouted, "Paris is free! Paris is free!" Some soldiers cried openly. One knelt on the pavement, overcome, as a group of civilians embraced him. Decades later, a Parisian journalist would write, "It was the day Paris rediscovered its heartbeat." When interviewed decades after the war, Parisians still spoke about that moment with tears in their eyes. A man who had been 12 years old at the time recalled, "That day is burned into my memory. I felt alive for the first time. I felt French again." A woman in her 80s told a historian, "The British marched like hope itself. They did not just free a city, they gave us back our dignity." For many, it remained the most emotional moment of their lives. Section 10. The Historical Turning Point. Paris belonged to the French again. The arrival of British troops in Paris wasn't just symbolic. It marked a decisive shift in the liberation of Western Europe. French forces, American troops, resistance fighters, and the British had together ensured the city's survival. Paris was no longer a jewel in the German crown. It was once again the heart of France, and the civilians knew it. That's why they shouted, "Liberté! Paris est libérée, and long live our allies." The city that had been silenced finally roared again. When British troops marched through Paris, the civilians did not greet them as strangers. They greeted them as heroes. Their words on that day were simple, raw, unforgettable. "You came for us. We will never forget. Paris is free because of you." And now, 80 years later, the echoes of those voices still travel through time. Paris had been wounded, starved, humiliated. But in one day, one triumphant, overwhelming day, it rose again. As one elderly Parisian said, when the British marched in, the city began to breathe. A chapter of darkness ended. A new chapter began. And history would never forget what the people of Paris said when British troops marched through their streets. Not as conquerors, but as liberators.